Okay, so for this class, we're going to go through the executive branch. We're going to cover various different presidential administrations. We're going to cover the idea of presidential cycles as well in Stephen Skoranik's book. Um, Now, it has basically become customary since Franklin Roosevelt, since FDR, to evaluate a president within their first 100 days in office. The reason being is that the first 100 days, usually the president is able to get, the most things accomplished. This is usually when they, enjoy their highest degree of popular support. This is their so-called, honeymoon phase, where they're, at least have somewhat more, leeway in getting done what they want done. Also, in the case of FDR, basically most of the New Deal legislation was essentially passed within his first 100 days in office. So ever since then, it has become, like I said, a customary thing to evaluate a president by their first 100 days in office. So using that, I mean, what can we say about the first 100 days of the Trump administration? Well, no significant laws were really passed. However, several executive orders were implemented by Trump. Now, an executive order, of course, does not have the same effect of law. It is, theoretically an interpretation of existing law, enabling the president to carry out laws which are already, on the books, so to say. But to say that it's a legitimate interpretation of laws, controversial at best. Probably the most noteworthy thing is Trump's executive order to end birthright citizenship within the United States. Now, this flagrantly contradicts the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which does state quite clearly, in fact, and we'll cover this more next class, that people born in the United States are citizens of the United States. It's a very unambiguous language for the most part. Trump, in his attempt to crack down on undocumented immigrants, as well as also many legal residents in the United States, is trying to end birthright citizenship. So if you are, parents, if you're undocumented immigrant parents living in the United States, but your children are born in the United States, those children would be considered citizens of the United States. Trump is essentially trying to end this. This is currently being contested in the courts. And, frankly, it's anybody's guess how this is going to play out. Trump has also rolled back transgender rights within the United States by redefining sex across every federal agency strictly as biological male and female determined at conception. Eliminates federal recognition of transgender identity, bans gender affirming care in federally supported settings, and restricts access to sex segregated facilities. He is withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement twice now. He did this during his first term in office, and then Biden put the U.S. back in. Trump is now withdrawn again. This is a framework for limiting greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions. The United States compliance with it is inconsistent at best, let's say. He's also initiated a deregulation order. For every new regulation, 10 existing regulations must be eliminated. This is the most aggressive deregulation mandate in U.S. History. It reshapes the administrative state by starving it of regulatory authority, basically, eliminating its ability to regulate corporations, which has long-term effects on the environment, labor, finance, safety, and consumer protection. His executive order on the immigrant invasion expands expedited deportations, revokes funding for sanctuary jurisdictions, and creates new penalties for undocumented immigrants who don't self-register. This is a sweeping shift in immigration enforcement towards maximal executive power. Deportation of legal residents under the Alien Enemies Act. For example, Kilmar Abrego Garcia is probably the most noteworthy example of this so far. Deported to what many consider to be a torture prison in El Salvador, violating a court order and his right to a hearing. Garcia was a legal resident in the United States. He had legal status within the United States. He was not undocumented, but was deported anyway. And even after his return, continues to be sort of targeted by the federal government for criminal charges. Deporting the Trump administration has also deported children who are U.S. citizens to Honduras. has signed executive orders, like I said, targeting sanctuary cities, deploying the military, bolstering protections for police accused of violence and murder. On April 14th, 2025, Trump met with El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele in the Oval Office to discuss potentially sending U.S. citizens to Salvadoran prisons as well. Trump reportedly said the homegrowns are next. You've got to build about 5 more places, referencing prison space needed in El Salvador. So basically talking about, you know, deporting people who are born in the United States as well. Unlawful detention of students and activists for protected speech, including Mahmoud Khalil, Rumesa Ozturk, and at least a dozen other high-profile cases. Basically, people who have been, detained, whether by ICE or other agencies, essentially for engaging in nonviolent protests. Ozturk's arrest is captured here on camera. I'll play it now for you. Oh, wait a second. Is the volume here? Yes. Yep. I'll show you. You're being led away in handcuffs there. Now all she essentially did was co-author I'm just getting back to my PowerPoint, co-author an editorial in her college newspaper, basically about the college's policies um, towards towards Israel. And for that, basically, as you can see, she's led away in handcuffs. Also, unlawful detention of individuals targeted for political reasons. Ward Sakic, a stateless Palestinian U.S. Resident, detained for 140 days. Now, she was not involved in any protests at all. She was simply only, seemingly, I should say, only detained because she is a Palestinian. The regime has also targeted universities attempting to rewrite a curricula and purge faculty and students under the banner of combating anti-Semitism as well, which many people would argue is, an extreme repression of freedom of speech. The first 100 days also saw through the Department through the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, tens of thousands of federal workers fired, dismantling of public agencies, slashing of corporate environmental regulations, canceled 400 grants totaling $1.7 billion for air, water, and climate protection, withdrew $20 billion in grants for reducing climate and local air pollution, supporting affordable clean energy. In addition to this, there are strong efforts to privatize public education being carried out by Linda McMahon, the Secretary of Education, as well as aggressive attempts to collect on student loan debts, including garnishing paychecks for people. Though some of this stuff has happened more recently, and of course, did not occur within the first 100 days. But Trump's budget, which I will get to in a moment, entailed massive cuts for social spending in the country as well. Under Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Trump administration has led a campaign to essentially destroy public health, as many people would call it. Again, these are all interpretations of events, but they are fairly widely shared. Firing of over 20,000 public health workers and discouraging vaccination efforts leading to the resurgence of diseases like measles, for example. Escalation of U.S. wars globally. Now, again, some of this falls outside of the first 100 days framework as well, but I couldn't resist including some of this. A lot of it does fall, the first bullet point here does basically fall within the first 100 days. Threats include annexation of Greenland, which of course continue to be made, Canada, the Panama Canal, the collapse of a ceasefire, and the resumption and intensification of fighting in Gaza, which again many people refer to as a genocide. Again, now this falls outside of the first 100 days, which basically ended on April 29th. But in June of last year, the U.S. Conducted airstrikes on Iran, part of a broader conflict often referred to as the Israel-Iran War. Trump publicly acknowledged these attacks and described them as spectacular military success. In Trump's first term, carried out the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, who was a major, important figure in the Iranian regime, which is a strong provocation against that government. So essentially, the Trump government has been trying to escalate conflict with Iran for a long time. We see current rhetoric by Trump in response to the major protests, which are now ongoing in Iran as well. And I would say very likely, probably within mere, days or weeks, maybe at the most, from some sort of military strike against Iran. Again, this is not a defense of the Iranian government, of course, but what right does the United States have to basically intervene in the internal affairs of another country like this? Especially given the track record of other countries which are allied with the United States as well. On January 3rd of this year, U.S. forces carried out a military operation in Venezuela, including strikes in and around Caracas. Of course, during this operation, the president, Maduro, and his wife were taken into U.S. Custody and flown to the United States to face charges, which are still ongoing now. I mean, this process is still ongoing now. Of course, this follows months of U.S. Military strikes against boats, which were claimed to be used for drug trafficking of cocaine, which has never been proven. In fact, evidence suggests, contrary to that claim. So yeah, basically another a provocative act on the part of the United States, which again, during Trump's, this also represents continuity of Trump's first term as well. Many people forget the attempted coup, which was carried out in Venezuela over Trump's first term, the recognition of this guy, Juan Guaido, who they claim was the legitimate president of the country, came to the United States, received a standing ovation from the Congress, including from Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats. A guy who literally, pretended to be the president of Venezuela for a period of time, which obviously is not true. So these are longstanding processes that are playing out. The U.S. attempts to undermine governments like Iran and Venezuela. And again, there's not a defense of these governments, but again, I mean, there's no real legitimate reason that the United States has to really be interfering in the internal affairs of these countries, other than an attempt at some kind of imperialistic domination of these countries. Which, of course, if you look at the history of these countries, they have been subject to U.S. backed dictatorships at many points in their history as well, especially Iran and especially Venezuela as well. Trump's approval rating after his first 100 days is very low, continues to be very low. Other presidents, Biden and Obama's approval rating after their first 100 days, much higher. It's not a compliment towards them. They eventually, especially Biden, became extremely unpopular as their administration wore on. But Trump does not seem to enjoy a high amount of popular support. Even in his first term was slightly higher, although not that high as well. And of course, the first 100 days have seen massive protests against the Trump administration, which of course continue as well. Also, now again, this falls outside of the first 100 days. I'm going to start to move beyond that limitation and talk about other things. But a major Supreme Court case, which has recently been decided in June, actually, of last year. Trump v. Casa. So in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court sided with the Trump administration, ending federal court's ability to issue universal injunctions, even against unconstitutional government actions. The ruling enables the government to prepare to enforce Trump's executive order, eliminating birthright citizenship, despite the 14th Amendment clearly guaranteeing it. So, as a result of this ruling, the judiciary is stripped of its ability to block unconstitutional executive orders nationwide. Federal judges are now restricted to granting relief only to the plaintiffs before them, not the public at large. So, what normally would have happened prior to this is that if Trump tried to do something blatantly unconstitutional, like, say, revoke somebody's birthright citizenship status, the courts would step in and say this is unconstitutional, not only in this specific instance, but would apply to all future attempts as well. Now, in a very unprecedented move, basically what the court is saying is that if the Trump administration does something unconstitutional, it only applies to the specific people involved in that case. Thus, basically opening the way to the for the Trump administration to attempt to do this in the future as well. So now what essentially does is that it forces anyone who is falls under this unconstitutional attempt to deport them or to revoke their citizenship status now has to each as an individual now has to basically file suit and challenge this in the courts. Well, as you might know, filing a lawsuit, especially against the federal government, is very time consuming, is very resource intensive, it's very expensive. That's a very hard thing to do. So what the Trump administration seems to be gambling on is that many people will, even if the Trump administration is basically doing something, blatantly unconstitutional, will not have the resources to defend themselves and will basically thus have to sort of submit to the administration's directives, even if the administration is basically doing something unconstitutional. Justice Sotomayor, in her dissenting opinion, called the order patently unconstitutional and compared the ruling to the Dred Scott decision that denied citizenship to African Americans. Again, this is probably one of the most significant attempts to, revoke or take away citizenship rights to people who legitimately deserve to be called citizens of the United States. Again, it suggests basic constitutional rights may only apply to litigants, not in a universal sense. So, again, it no longer, one judicial ruling does not then sort of cover the sort of blanket applicability where it would sort of automatically come into play during future attempts. Now it basically forces each person to have to individually attempt to defend themselves in court. Many legal analysts say this opens the door for Trump or future presidents to ban protests and strikes, to arrest political dissidents, to censor the press, to strip basic democratic rights without fear of court orders halting enforcement nationwide. So, once again, even if the administration does something illegal or unconstitutional, it basically forces each person who is sort of, on the receiving end of this to have to defend themselves in court. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the top cabinet officials or the top officials within the administration. Of course, the president sits on top of a vast bureaucracy and doesn't, personally direct everything that's going on. There are, of course, differences in leadership style. Some presidents like to personally manage things more. Some presidents like to delegate things more. Trump seems to be somewhat more of a delegator. In fact, he claims not even to be, aware of a lot of things that the administration is doing. So, for that reason, I think it's worthwhile to, just briefly run down. I won't really comment too much on any of them, although a lot of these people do, if you look into them more, have pretty nasty skeletons in their closet and things like that. But you have Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's, again, generally believed to be behind the recent operation in Venezuela. This is something more or less that he masterminded, I guess you could say. And he's not done, right? I mean, the next target basically on the list is Cuba. Venezuela was sort of like a means to sort of open up Cuba for this kind of intervention as well. But you have Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, a typical Wall Street financier. Um, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, um, no real military experience. Um, was did serve in the military, was not like a high-ranking, officer, a general or a colonel or anything like that. Um, Basically, his biggest claim to fame is that he was a Fox News host. And of course, there's no prior political experience either. The Attorney General, Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General, was involved in Trump's first impeachment defense. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Health and Human Services Secretary, well-known vaccine skeptic, also an environmental lawyer, now basically oversees the federal health agencies. You have Food and Drug Administration Director, Dr. Marty Makary, Johns Hopkins, a professor, surgeon, nominated to lead FDA. Similar views to Kennedy, I would say, for the most part. Kristi Noem, Homeland Security Secretary, now currently facing impeachment charges. We'll see how that plays out. Former South Dakota governor, again, oversees security within the United States. Basically, is overseeing ICE as well, as part of the Department of Homeland Security, an agency that was, by the way, only created during the Bush administration after 9/11. By the way, Education Secretary Linda McMahon, co-founder of the WWE, former Small Business Administration head in the first Trump administration, are largely overseeing Trump's attempts to sort of, defund public education, go after student loan borrowers, and so forth. Other key figures, well, Elon Musk is no longer there, but was the head of Doge, one of the most, public figures of the early days of the Trump administration. After, but they've had some kind of falling out since then. You have National Institutes of Health Director Jay Bhattacharya, another sort of COVID denier, in the same mold as RFK Jr., who's said some pretty crazy things about COVID himself. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, a former Democrat who's supposed to be this anti-war Democrat, now part of the Trump administration, seemingly going along with all of Trump's imperialistic foreign policy plans. Border czar Tom Homan, like Kristi Noem, a top official overseeing Trump's crackdown on undocumented immigrants. Interestingly enough, Homan was actually an Obama appointee who was sort of carried over and promoted under the Trump administration. You have ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, Christian fundamentalist, very conservative Christian type. Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, again, along with Noam, pretty much the intellectual architect behind Trump's immigration policies. FBI Director Kash Patel, again, another guy like Hegseth, no real experience, running an agency as large and complicated as the FBI, and of course a powerful agency like the FBI as well. OMB Director Russell Vought, Office of Management and Budget. Vought was one of the minds behind the Heritage Foundation's what was it called, the 2025 plan or something like that. Basically, this plan to severely defund the federal government. Then special envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, who also plays a leading role in Trump's policies regarding Gaza and their approach to Israel as well. Let's talk a little bit about Trump's budget now. On July 4th, Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act into law. It permanently extends the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts, introduces new tax cuts partially offsets these cuts via spending cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, and student loan. It only partially offsets the cuts. The tax cuts, the shrinking of revenue from these tax cuts is even greater than the spending cuts. This will actually, drastically expand the government deficit. Total projected cost 3.4 trillion over 10 years, exceeding 4 trillion when interest on the debt is included. So this is how much it will basically, grow the government debt, which is already hovering around $40 trillion, by the way. In 2008, it was around $5 trillion. So the government just piled on massive amounts of debt, basically through these types of, bailouts and tax cuts, basically. Especially, the COVID bailout in 2020. 3 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthy. Military spending for 2025 increased by 150 billion, a record $1 trillion. Now, people already argue that already understates the true military spending of the United States through some clever accounting tricks. They're able to sort of push off some of their military spending to different government agencies and departments. So true military spending could be as high as 1.5 trillion, something like that, maybe even more. Massive increase in the budget of Department of Homeland Security, 175 billion increase. Increased funding for police intelligence and surveillance programs, militarization of law enforcement in major cities and along borders. Now, again, to partially offset these massive tax cuts and spending increases for defense and policing, 930 billion is set to be cut from Medicaid. Massive cuts to people's health insurance, their health coverage. Millions of people, at least 10 million people, are projected to lose coverage through cuts to Medicaid, as well as to restrictions in the Affordable Care Act. 16 to 17 million total uninsured by 2034, when subsidy expiration is included. So this includes cuts to Medicaid, as well as the repeal of the ACA tax credits, which were passed in 2021. Medicaid, 7 to 10 million fewer enrollees by 2034. Roughly about 4.5 to 5 million dropped in 2026. In 2026 from work rules alone. Basically, stronger eligibility requirements that most people who are on Medicaid can't meet, which will then result in their coverage being terminated. ACA marketplace enrollment falls from about almost 23 million to about 15 million or 15.5 million in the next 5 years. Low income Medicare beneficiaries, about 1.5 million will lose their Medicare savings programs and drug subsidies. Now, this is a Medicare too, not just a Medicaid. SNAP, food stamps, basically 285 billion cut, a 20% reduction. Nearly 11 million people affected by this, including 4 million children. Changes include shifting more administrative cost burdens to states. Analysis suggests these changes will put millions of families at risk of reduced benefits or losing benefits entirely. Environmental and regulatory policy dismantles regulations and environmental oversight, very friendly to fossil fuel companies, grants exemptions to polluters, and rolls back climate initiatives. So this is going to have significant cost upon people. So how do we attempt to frame this? The socialist writer, Marxist, Friedrich Engels, coined the term social murder in his book on the English working class in 1845. So Engels defines social murder as when society systematically places workers in conditions that inevitably cause premature, unnatural death. Death appears, quote unquote, natural because it results from systemic neglect, not a single act. Society knows the consequences, but permits harmful conditions to continue. Now, certainly, if we were to apply this definition to Trump's budget, you could certainly apply this term. Obviously, cutting back on people's health insurance, cutting back on their food stamps, this will literally lead to the deaths of possibly millions of people. because of this. So Trump calls this a beautiful bill. If we want an alternative framing to it, maybe we could refer to it as the social murder bill or the social murder budget or the murder death kill budget. Murder death kills from a movie. But anyway, I think this term social murder is an interesting concept because it's not really a term that's in our normal vocabulary for the most part. I mean, again, usually when we think of a murder, we think of it again, as Engel says, intentional bodily harm, direct physical harm I inflict upon another person that leads to their death. We're much less used to thinking about murder that comes through what he calls, systemic neglect, just neglecting the livelihood of people, or implementing policies that are basically guaranteed to shorten people's lifespan, but do it anyway. This is again what he calls social murder. I think it's a concept that people should maybe think about a little bit more. Gradual undermining of health and life expectancy. Again, the United States already has a much lower life expectancy than most other industrialized countries, and these things will basically only make it worse. Now, if you look at Trump's tax proposals, who's really going to benefit from this? Well, not surprisingly, it's basically the highest income earners. This is from the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy. Now, they're showing, basically broken up into different tiers. The lowest 20% of income earners, the second 20% income earners, the middle group, and then going on to the highest groups. What their projected benefits will be, how much money they will be saving basically in tax cuts. Now, interestingly, they also incorporate the price increases from tariffs as well, which is a real thing. They are basing this on a 60% tariff on China, which is not currently what we have now as a result of negotiations. The average, basically sort of the average tariff, if you sort of average out the different tariff rates on China is basically about around a 30% tariff rate. So some of these numbers would have to be adjusted here. What they're showing basically is if you increase, and a tariff is a tax. It's not a tax that you pay when you file your tax return, obviously. But you can think of it almost like a kind of like a sales tax. It is a tax on imports, and those and the higher costs that importers face are then usually passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. So they're saying that when you incorporate those higher prices as a result of basically the import tax, the tariff, then most people will basically be losing money. When you see these positive numbers at the bottom, that means the net increase in prices that people will have to be paying. And so basically what happens here is that most people will basically be losing money. They will save a little bit money on taxes, but the price increase that they will be facing will more than compensate for whatever money they're saving on taxes. The only group that will still see a net benefit from this will actually be saving more money are the richest 1% and the next 4% underneath them. Are the only ones, because they will see such a massive tax reduction, even though they will be paying higher prices as well, will still come out net a net benefit to them, whereas everyone else will basically see their a deduction of their income. That number on the bottom is basically how much they, 1430, 1530, for example, is how much less income you will basically have. Now, again, it would have to be adjusted because of the tariffs not being quite as high as it is projected here. But I would say even taking away the tariffs, let's completely exclude the tariffs. How much money are people really going to be saving through Trump's tax cuts? If you look at the second 20% income earners, basically people making around 30,000 to about 55,000, they're only going to be saving about $700 a year because of these tax cuts. Now, if you average that out monthly, that's about $58 a month that you'll be saving. I mean, How is that going to do anything for anybody? You have an extra $58 a month that you can spend. What do you do? For the middle 20% group, people making about 55,000 to about 94,000. I think that's about what, 1,700, 1,800 a month. Yeah, about 1,800 a month or so, or about 1,900 a month. But still, it's about $160 a month or something like that. What's that really going to do for you? Not all that much. Let me just see, because I calculated based on 1,800, but I could see now looking at it's about $1,900 a month divided by 12. I think I have my calculator in there, but yeah, it is about $158 a month. Well, try not to spend it all in one place. So I mean, this is the very small benefit, negligible, really, that people are going to see. These are people, basically within the middle income brackets. Now, again, if you go higher up the income scale, people are going to see, some fairly significant savings over that. But once again, I mean, if you really need a detailed argument to show you why tax cuts only really benefit the wealthiest earners, which I think most people already know or should know, you could basically see the breakdown of it here. Now, with that being said, I want to delve into more of an issue of political theory here, which is, can Donald Trump really be considered to be a fascist? I want to take this issue a bit seriously, right? Because many people throw this term around, and as people say, they kind of hurl this word around more as like a kind of insult or a derogatory term without any real sort of serious, meaning behind it. I want to give a serious analysis and understanding of what fascism is, and then argue that I think even taking this idea seriously, you can make a pretty good argument that Donald Trump does resemble a fascist. He may not be a fascist that has complete control over everything yet, but there certainly seems to be a sort of fascist insurgency movement that is sort of seeking to take control of the government and sort of establish a kind of you know uh, a dictatorship under him, or at least like-minded people. And you do see this, in sort of eating away at constitutional norms, checks and balances. The system of checks and balances has been able to sort of reassert itself in some ways, but in other, I mean, there are numerous instances where the Trump administration has blatantly, defied court orders or have been very slow to follow them. We've talked, in a previous class, even if courts have, so far prevented sort of full scale military deployment to many cities across the United States, the presence of highly militarized law enforcement agencies, for the most part, what would be experienced and felt by the population as if it was a military occupation anyway. I think this is actually another instance of this kind of idea of form without substance, which going back to Sheldon Wolin and his idea of inverted totalitarianism. I mean, that is one of the sort of the key ideas here, and I think is one of what makes it very interesting theory of politics, is that Wolin is one of the few political analysts that is able to really sort of see beyond just the formality of politics, just the sort of the official categorization of political regimes, and really try to look deeper to see if the actual sort of substance of what these things claim to be is actually there. I would argue that most political scientists and maybe most people in the social sciences, generally speaking, are for the most part content with just kind of like a formalistic definition of things. In other words, formalities. We all know what formalities are. We engage in formalities where there's sort of a difference between our outward behavior and what we really feel inside, maybe. How many times have you seen people, talking to somebody at a party or something like that, and that person doesn't like that person, but they sort of observe the social niceties anyway, and then as soon as that person walks away, they call them a bitch or something like that. We've all seen people do things like that. That is on a smaller scale, of course, this idea of sort of form without substance, people sort of engaging in sort of external actions, but sort of lacking the inner essence of it. Um, and again, I mean, that is essentially what Wolin's critique of democracy is that democratic governments, particularly the United States, have the formality of democratic government, but it's sort of the missing the substance of it. And quite frankly, I spent some time trying to disentangle the fairly complicated legal maneuverings behind, full-scale military deployment to U.S. cities versus use of National Guard versus law uh, enforcement. And again, I said, even if the court systems has been able to, in some cases, prevent deployment of National Guard or to, prevent, full-scale military deployment, which again, we should also keep in mind there is a legal mechanism to do that through the Insurrection Act. But even, of course, have been able to prevent full-scale National Guard deployment in some instances. We shouldn't, forget that this could be just another formality. That if you allow militarized law enforcement agencies to basically run amok in these cities, as they are in many cases, the idea of so again, essentially has sort of the substance of a kind of military style occupation anyway, even if it's lacking in the formality of it. That's another, again, instance of what I would call, form without substance here. The substance is real, even if the formality of a military occupation might be lacking. And again, I think Wolin's one of really a few theorists, at least contemporary thinkers, who was able to really do that, to really sort of look at politics at a deeper level than just the formality of things. Anyway, so where does fascism come from? How can we gain a kind of understanding of it? Fascism sort of emerges out of the 20th century. People sometimes talk about proto-fascist movements in the 19th century. We're not going to concern ourselves too much with that. I'm mostly going to follow the interpretations of fascism by Marxist theorists like Leon Trotsky, Anton Pankouk, and various others, who I think probably have the most sophisticated understanding of fascism. And then fascism is a counter-revolutionary movement that sort of emerges in reaction to sort of socialism, basically, or sort of emerges in reaction to radical working class movements. The two countries we most often associate with fascism, Germany and Italy, were both sites of revolutionary movements by workers after World War I. So that supports that idea. It also emerges in a period of acute capitalist crisis. The ruling class can no longer govern in the usual way. The normal mechanics of so-called parliamentary democracy, which is more or less our system of government as well. We don't refer to it as a parliament, of course, but sort of representative government that is, formalistically a democratic government, can no longer govern in the usual way. The sort of social conflicts have grown to such a radical point where that system of government is no longer able to sort of contain things in the usual way. There's the looming threat of again, radical working class movements, which threats to assert itself politically through a revolution. And then basically fascism, emerges as an attempt to sort of break the back of that kind of working class resistance, which it did do in Germany and Italy. It seems quite clear when you look at it that way. Even the way in which they modeled themselves. I mean, it's interesting, and this is another important thing. Fascist movements often sort of co-opted or sort of took certain elements from radical movements at that point in time. The kind of sort of militaristic, party discipline, you could say, was in some ways sort of, borrowed from socialist and communist political parties at this point in time, even trying to sort of invoke this kind of false, populist rhetoric. You could argue sort of, co-opted from the radical workers movements and socialist movements of this period of time. Now, this would be one major objection people would have to saying that fascism is in the United States right now. If fascism emerges in response to radical revolutionary working class act activity, then they say, well, then there's no reason for fascism here in the United States. There is no revolutionary workers movement here in the United States. And that is true. However, can you sort of reinterpret the theory uh, in a way that speaks to U.S. circumstances? And I think there's at least two or three things that you could say about it. One, saying there's no radical or revolutionary workers movement now um, takes kind of a short view of history and sort of overlooks the fact that there were movements like that in the past that have basically already been crushed. Um, I think another objection you could make is that, well, maybe there is no revolutionary workers movement now, but is the attempt to move towards fascism or some sort of more authoritarian political formation here in the United States, kind of like a preemptive strike? Are they trying to sort of reassert power now, anticipating perhaps a future revolutionary movement developing within the United States, of which there is at least some evidence, right, of increasing radicalization of the masses here in the United States? Again, not to the point where it's sort of really coalescing into a true revolutionary movement, but maybe they're not going to wait around for that to happen, and would rather sort of take preemptive action now to prevent that from happening. We've in other words, we've normally interpreted fascism as acting in reaction to working class movements, but we also have to put this in a kind of historical context as well. What if learning from the past, what if drawing upon past lessons, the current ruling class wants to act now before that becomes a power? So it's no longer a reaction to a revolutionary workers movement, but a sort of preemptive attempt to prevent a revolutionary workers movement from forming within the United States. That I think is certainly possible. And maybe the third thing that you could argue is that, well, fascism in the United States kind of operates in a different way, right? It doesn't act necessarily in the overt form of Germany and Italy, but it's more characteristic, again, of what Wolin would refer to as inverted totalitarianism. With the caveat that even the kind of formality of democracy that Wolin still observed, then even that is kind of falling apart, right? As the government becomes more sort of blatantly authoritarian. So like I said, I think there's at least two or three objections you could make to the idea that, well, all right, there's no revolutionary workers movement in the United States, therefore the whole argument for fascism should be thrown out. Again, it takes a sort of narrow view of history. It does not consider past attempts at sort of crushing movements like that when they did exist. It sort of completely overlooks the idea that this is sort of a preemptive move. And it really doesn't take into account the sort of differing circumstances, how power would sort of exercise itself even under the facade of a democratic government in the way in which Wolin examined for example. Now turning more to the sort of class basis of fascism. So theorists like Trotsky and Pankow both emphasize, and these are various different perspectives that they are bringing into play here. Pankow was a socialist, but was very much opposed to the Soviet Union. But they both agree that basically fascism sort of draws its support from what they call the enraged petty bourgeois, basically like the lower middle class, or what could be literally termed, the small bourgeoisie. That's what they mean by petty, and the lumpen proletariat. And the lumpen proletariat basically refers to, some people refer to as a kind of sub-proletariat, or basically, people who would fall within the working class, but are basically not regularly employed people. People sort of fall into the informal sector of the economy, unemployed people, criminals even. The term lumpen proletariat has cast sort of a wide net over who could correspond to that. But basically, it's referring to people who sort of come out of the sort of lower class, but are not part of the sort of regular workforce. And again, it's historically been observed that the sort of stormtroopers that both Hitler and Mussolini formed were sort of drawn out of these social layers. They sort of came out of the lower middle class. They sort of came out of certain segments of the working class or the lower class who were not sort of a regular part of the workforce as well. Now, many people have drawn similar comparisons between the class bases of that and groups like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and even ICE. People often joke that members of ICE are basically out of shape guys who couldn't get hired anywhere else. Now, I'm not saying that's not some sort of caricature or something like that, but there's probably at least an element of truth to it. I'm not saying like literally every single member is out of shape, but there does seem to be some observation of that to say the least. And the idea of these people could not be sort of regularly employed anywhere else. There does seem to be some kind of again overlap between these sort of social classes that sort of form the mass movement of fascist groups in the 20s and 30s, and who sort of form the sort of violent groups that either within the government or outside of the government basically support the Trump administration as well. What these groups do is they function to crush working class organizations, dismantle democratic institutions, and preserve capitalist property relations. Now, if we go back to my article about January 6th, I mean, that was sort of the crux of my argument there, is that the reason why the government was so soft on the January 6th rioters, insurrectionists, whatever you want to call them, was because for all their violence, they didn't really represent any real threat to sort of property relations under capitalism, and so they can be tolerated to a much larger extent than other groups who, even if they're not overtly socialist or anti-capitalist, at least maybe have the potential to be like that, or maybe they are to some extent, but not fully. Black Lives Matter, I think, would be a good example of that. They have some kind of a socialist consciousness. They're proto-socialist, or whatever you want to call them, or maybe they don't have a fully developed understanding of socialist theory, but there's at least potential there, and so they're deemed as much more of a threat. Added to that, the obvious racial dynamics of it as well. But I wouldn't want to only reduce it to racial dynamics. Also, I think you have to encompass both that as well as their situation and their position in regards to capitalist social relations as well. Which group represents more of a threat to it? Which group is more tolerant of it? I mean the Proud Boys and all these other groups, I mean, they have no problem with capitalist relations at all, in fact. Okay. And yes, and even though it draws its support from the lower and middle classes, ultimately, of course, it serves the big capitalist interests, especially monopoly capitalism. Now, that's one perspective on it, sort of drawing upon the sort of class basis of it. But I want to briefly run through a few other points of view on fascism, each of which I think offers a different perspective on it. Again, I want to really take seriously this idea and not just be accused of one of the people just like throws this term around casually. Maybe this will help other people have a more sort of developed understanding of what fascism really is. So the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who was a victim of fascism in Italy, argues that fascism and really any political movement can't only rule by just brute force alone, right? It also has to build what he calls a kind of ideological hegemony as well. This term hegemony is highly associated with Gramsci. And basically, it is how you get people to sort of consent to your rule. How do you get people to more or less, accept things the way they are without directly using force upon them? And of course, Gramsci sort of, pioneered later developments in the study of mass media, education, religious institutions, even unions, and how these institutions function to kind of, manufacture a sense that the social hierarchy that exists is more or less a natural thing and should just be accepted. And so we can then use that to investigate how fascism does that as well. How did fascist movements get people to sort of accept the kind of hierarchical power relationships of uh, fascists as natural and normal and something to be accepted? Of course, as we know, fascist movements made heavy use of propaganda and control of the media as it existed in their day. They exerted strict control over education and other institutions, which would sort of, influence the beliefs of people in their society. Um, in many ways, fascism is not really a coherent political ideology, but can be considered sort of an approach to politics. It sort of represents a very kind of sort of brute force approach to politics. It's more of like a tactic than it is a coherent a belief in something. Um, but it has to do more than just rely upon brute force also. So it often, references certain, ideological constructs or conceptions to sort of, secure its power as well. Oftentimes it borrows from nationalism, a sort of, mythical view of the past. It likes to invoke traditional values, visions of national rebirth. Now, again, these are not necessarily unique to fascism either, right? But these are just among the sort of tools in which fascists use to sort of, create a system of beliefs basically that allow people more or less to voluntarily sort of, submit to their power. Fascists often, have to focus on capital crisis since they usually emerge out of moments like this. But they have to reframe the capitalist crisis not as an intrinsic problem within the capitalist system itself, of course, but something caused by the outside forces, traders, internal enemies. Traditionally speaking, Jews, communists, immigrants, feminists, um, as well as other groups, LGBTQ. I mean, there's a whole litany of people that you could see as some sort of enemy, a scapegoat, if you will, that it becomes a convenient way of essentially blaming the problems of society on. It appeals more to emotion than to rational thought, um, and gives people this idea, a sort of false sense of unity from that as well. Another perspective that we could look at is the psychological perspective, pioneered by a group of thinkers often referred to as the Frankfurt School. These were German intellectuals who actually fled Hitler's Germany and came to the United States. Chief among them was a guy known as Theodor Adorno. Adorno participated in a study later on known as the authoritarian personality. There's a lot to be said. I'm just running through this very quickly. But what he and others working with him tried to do is try to derive a kind of, a fascist personality type, except they didn't call it fascism because they were doing the study in the United States and they were a little, afraid of backlash. So they termed it the authoritarian personality instead, a little more generic sounding. But interestingly, they identified certain characteristics which I think are helpful to look at as well. They said the fascist personality type, or the authoritarian personality type, is a mindset marked by fear, submission to authority, and domination of the marginalized. And it's this key relationship here between, submissiveness to authority figures, and while simultaneously trying to dominate marginalized figures at the same time. It's this weird, kind of, quite frankly, sort of, kinky combination of submission and domination at the same time. And if I say that, I mean, these are people who've obviously read Sigmund Freud and are adapting his theories. And as we all know, Freud was, obsessed with sex and things like that. I'm exaggerating, of course, but that's there, certainly. And so they sort of, incorporate that into their, study of fascism as well. Of course, it is a, reaction to modern alienation as well. This term alienation certainly is a term that people like to throw around a lot. People's sense of isolation and disconnect from society. The idea that they are humanized by the workings of modern day, economic systems and political system, highly bureaucratized uh, political systems, giant corporate monopolies where they're sort of engulfed in, and their humanity basically is almost non-existent. So it's a reaction to that, which is a reaction that many people have. The question is that why do some people react one way to it and other people get sort of are sort of more drawn to this you know behavioral pattern of again submission to authority while also trying to dominate marginalized groups at the same time. The personality structure is not innate, but shaped by the contradictions and anxiety of capitalist modernity. Again, Adorno and others would also point to child rearing as well. Of course, another key, Freudian theme as well. How you're raised by your parents obviously plays a big role in the later development of this kind of personality type. And then finally, and then we'll start to move on from this. I don't want to spend too much time on it. These are very interesting topics, but there's a lot to talk about. From the anti-colonial school of political theory, or decolonization, Franz Fanon, Aimé, Césaire, argued that basically fascism is inseparable from imperialism and racial hierarchy. Aimé Césaire argued that fascism was as he called it, the boomerang of colonial violence. You throw the boomerang out and then it eventually returns back to you. So, which is an interesting idea as well. Again, another a perspective that we can use here. And all these are, different in some ways. So, it also depends on what perspective that you want to adopt. I think all of them have some value, of course. But basically what he is arguing is that the sort of tactics or techniques of control developed through colonialism and imperialism were later sort of brought back and implemented against the domestic populations. So without the sort of these techniques of control sort of being refined through the imperialism of the late 19th century, that you would not have had fascism, or at least it would not have emerged in the same way. The specific ways in which you use to control the population has particular significance for the United States, of course, which has a long history nowadays of imperialism, even if it doesn't seek direct conquest, but imperialism through military interventions and trying to influence the politics of other countries. Now, both Germany and Italy itself were colonial powers, though they were somewhat lesser colonial powers. But you can still argue had enough experience in colonialism that they would have learned enough to sort of bring these again these techniques of control back home. Even if they didn't, you could still observe the sort of more extensive colonial empires of France and Great Britain, and been able to learn from them as well. So again, another interesting point of view. Now, some people would argue that Trump is not a fascist, but he's an authoritarian, and that seems to be a little bit more safer territory for people who don't want to go quite all the way and say that Trump is a fascist. But what really is the difference between an authoritarian ruler and a fascist ruler? Well, there is a distinction that exists in political science, but I would argue that the term authoritarianism itself is sort of a product of the Cold War, and frankly, was coined as a way to kind of legitimize to some extent U.S. support of basically fascist dictatorships throughout the world, and sort of gave them a way to sort of avoid calling them fascism. Now, if you look at the history of the term, especially as it's used in modern day political science, it has a very interesting history. Now, they didn't necessarily invent the term, but for example, Karl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski, I'm not sure if I'm saying his first name correctly, are two scholars who helped define authoritarianism in their influential work, Totalitarian Dictatorship and Autocracy from 1956. This is right at the peak of the Cold War. And both these guys were unabashed cold warriors. They were very much, invested in the U.S.'s conflict against the Soviet Union. They were very anti-Soviet. Brzezinski, who served as a advisor to several presidential administrations, was very anti-Soviet and even very anti-Russian. Even after the breakup of the Soviet Union, continued to pursue a very anti-Russian policy. He's one of the people who came up with the bright idea that we should keep expanding NATO eastward even after the end of the Cold War. He was also among the people who had the bright idea of funding Islamic extremists in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in the 1970s, 1980s, which later led to the formation of Al Qaeda, of course, the Mujahideen. Not the greatest idea in hindsight. So they were very much at the forefront, like I said, of a lot of these intellectual developments, even going beyond that, like I said, serving as a high-level advisor in presidential administrations as well. So they refer to authoritarianism as a political system in which a single leader or a small group holds significant power, but they claim there's still some limited political pluralism, often with restrictions on political freedom and liberties. So there's an intellectual distinction that you can make between those things, whereas fascism would not allow any kind of pluralism. But I would argue that the differences between the two are pretty vague. Now, they also distinguish authoritarianism from totalitarianism. So fascism is also basically associated with totalitarianism as well. The term was widely popularized by Hannah Arendt in her books, The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, again, coming out of this Cold War era, where she analyzed the totalitarian regimes of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. So she conflates Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as forms of totalitarianism, even though the ideologies of the Nazi Party and of the Soviet Union are very different from each other. Arendt defined totalitarianism as a regime that seeks to control all aspects of public and private life, including the thoughts of individuals. So later theorists would sort of create kind of like a hierarchy between totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And totalitarianism is clearly seen as like the greater evil. And since Nazi Germany and Italy under Mussolini, which some people would argue was not totalitarian anyway, some do, did not survive the war. Totalitarianism basically came to be applied almost exclusively to communist governments, Soviet Union, China, Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, and a handful of others. And so it clearly came to be the case that, totalitarianism was the greater of two evils. Authoritarianism was the lesser of two evils. So it was okay to support authoritarian governments like the Shah of Iran, like various Latin American dictatorships, including in Venezuela during this period of time, like the Batista government in Cuba, the pre-Castro government there, like Franco in Spain. The list goes on. Indonesia, Zaire. You could make a pretty long list actually of authoritarian governments that the United States supported. So my argument here, and I'm sorry if I'm getting a bit too into the weeds with this, but this is political science theory stuff, is that again, just to restate it, I would argue that authoritarianism is kind of a substitute term for fascism, and that authoritarianism is also meant to suggest that it is the lesser of two evils compared to totalitarian governments. So both things very much serve a very sort of important Cold War ideological function. These are tools to make the Cold War policies of the United States seem more acceptable than what they could be, considered if you basically consider the United States was supporting fascist governments, which were probably the greater of two evils, quite frankly, compared to a lot of the governments that they were opposed to. During the Cold War, the U.S. backed right-wing regimes across the so-called global South that contain communism. These governments use repression, censorship, and violence against leftist movements. often resembling fascist tactics, yet were typically labeled as authoritarian. Now, Gene Kirkpatrick, who again was an academic who later served under the Reagan administration, another sort of unapologetic Cold War hawk, writes that uh, traditional authoritarian governments are less repressive than revolutionary autocracies, or in other words, totalitarian governments. So quite clearly saying that these are like the lesser of two evils. Yeah, they're not great, but they're not as bad as the alternative. And I would argue, in many cases, they're probably actually worse. Well, I'll leave that for people who want to study the historical record of this a little bit more. In this context, using the term authoritarian instead of fascist was a way to avoid the implication that these regimes were fascist and performed the same function of crushing working class resistance. So again, going back to Trump, calling Trump an authoritarian is not really an alternative to calling him a fascist. You're basically calling him a fascist, but using a more sort of generic, sort of sanitized term. And I could go more into the Cold War aspects of this, but I'll try to move things along. Another contributor to this concept is the political scientist and sociologist Juan Linz, who wrote an essay and basically wrote several books, also talking about the difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. One of his early works was to characterize Francoist Spain under Francisco Franco as an authoritarian government. Basically, I would argue that Franco's regime could essentially be considered a fascist government in any possible way, and so this idea of calling it authoritarian was simply a way of sort of whitewashing essentially what was going on. If you look at the history of the Franco regime, which emerged in the 1930s and was in fact an ally of Nazi Germany and Italy, although it stayed smartly stayed out of World War II, emerged more or less around the same point in time. Basically lasted until the 1970s. And that's important as well because, again, during the Cold War, it became an ally of the United States as well. But if you look at how the Franco regime operated, it's basically indistinguishable from how, a fascist regime like Italy or Germany would have functioned. And, again, because it never went to war and never faced, its destruction the way not Nazi Germany did. I mean, it never went to the extremes that the Nazi regime went to keep itself into power either. I mean, maybe it could more. Well, all right. Let me just move on here. So I think this kind of gives you a clue. This is a picture of Franco, the little man you can see there in the military outfit, riding in a car with President Gerald Ford in the 1970s. I believe this is the same year he died, in fact. And I think this picture here gives you a hint, or more than a hint, of why American political scientists and European political scientists and sociologists would prefer to call these regimes authoritarian. Imagine if it was a matter of public record or consciousness that the United States president is basically riding in a car with an avowed fascist leader. I mean, how would that play to the American public, let alone, the publics in many other countries? So I think it simply became a convenient way to kind of, cover up the character of these governments by referring to them as authoritarian. Instead, here's Franco, or here's, a picture of the Franco regime, or a mass meeting of Franco supporters in the 1930s. You can see a lot of the kind of cult of personality, which we tend to associate with totalitarianism, and fascism is there as well. Okay, I think I've kind of made the point. You can see I spend a lot of time talking about this, but at this point, after saying a lot of this, I feel pretty confident I've made my point. What I'm saying here, real quick, is that people often cite the difference between a totalitarian regime from an authoritarian regime is that you don't have this constant mobilization of people. Wolin talks about that too, by the way, as a difference between inverted totalitarianism from classical totalitarianism. You don't have this mass mobilization of people. I think that's somewhat exaggerated. I think in both Mussolini's Italy and in Nazi Germany, while mobilization of the masses, big sort of large demonstrations of people in support of the regime was an early feature of these governments, especially when they were seeking power, and continued to be to some extent even after power. I think in practice, these regimes did settle into more kind of typical sort of bureaucratic style control over things, and after a while it tended to de-emphasize these kinds of things. Or if they did, they continue to be just kind of a formulaic thing. I mean, you probably see the same level of mass mobilization at your average, American football game, quite frankly, with all its militaristic and nationalistic trappings than you would see in a you know mass uh, meeting of the Nazis during the 1930s. That's probably the kind of thing that people would object to. But so you can see the power of the executive branch has grown significantly. So I've made my case for why I think you could refer to Trump as a fascist. Um, I'd be curious to hear what people think about that. Um, the power of the presidency has grown, especially since Franklin Roosevelt, who's often referred to as the first modern president, and that he was the first president to really govern over a massive federal bureaucracy, such as we continue to have today, which of course has only continued to grow since then. Real quick, I won't run through all these things, but again, during Roosevelt's first 100 days, most of the key aspects of the New Deal were basically passed, and these were actual laws, not just a series of executive orders as passed by Trump, as you can see here. But now I want to get into this idea of presidential cycles. So in Skowronek's book, the Politics Presidents Make, he talks about there being at least 5 different presidential cycles. So that's a lot easier than remembering, the names of all the presidents, obviously. And what he is arguing here, and what I think is an interesting concept, is that presidents can be sort of grouped together in these cycles, largely dependent on or related to the kind of historical context in which they are dealing with. Presidents tend to govern in similar ways, corresponding to their cycle. Even presidents from different political parties, the cycle that they belong to actually matters more than their party. The parties themselves basically change in relation to the historical context of their day as well. So if we focus on mainly just the New Deal and the Reagan cycle, Democrats and Republicans who fall within the New Deal cycle govern in more of a similar way. And Democrats and Republicans in the Reagan cycle tend to govern in a more similar way. But the New Deal cycle and the Reagan cycle are almost like the inverse of each other. So, and then there's a question of, has the Reagan cycle ended? I would argue it has not. Basically the dominant priorities of the Reagan cycle, especially favoring capital interests over labor, still continues to be true today, and that again crosses party lines as well. There's been no significant sort of erosion of the power of capital over the political system in relation to labor, whereas again, at least taken at face value, one of the defining aspects of the New Deal era was the rising power of labor as a political force, organized labor as a political force here within the United States. And that power has just simply never returned since then. And you can say, well, isn't that a long time? Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. We're like, 45 years out from that. I mean, these cycles can last for a long time. I mean, the New Deal cycle lasted almost 50 years. The Republican cycle prior to that lasted almost 75 years, from the Civil War basically up to the Great Depression. So these things can certainly play out for 40 years or more. Some of the cycles were a little bit shorter. I'm not going to run through all of them, of course. Like I said, mostly focus on the last two. I'll talk a little bit about the Civil War era. Well, anyway, so let me just get into it, and maybe I can help explain a little bit more. So, um, the Republican cycle began during the Civil War. The Republican Party emerged, just a few years prior to this as well. I don't think a lot of people realize that, but Abraham Lincoln is the first Republican Party uh, president, and in the words of Eric Foner, historian of the Civil War and of that period of time, Lincoln's views on slavery certainly evolved over time. When the Civil War began, Lincoln wanted to end the war without ending slavery. By 1864, however, became pretty obvious that that was not going to happen. That the only way in which this war, that slavery would have to end as well. And this is the 1864 election. While the Civil War was still ongoing, it's quite in many ways sort of an extraordinary thing that an election was even held during this point in time, where a big chunk of the country had basically seceded from the country. Those are why those states are sort of blacked out there. You can see that Lincoln won quite handedly over the Democratic opponent, who basically the Democratic Party platform basically wanted to seek peace with the South um, at any cost, even if it meant keeping slavery. So it says something, I think, that the majority of people were basically, at this point at least, willing to see the war end, and be brought to a conclusive close with the end of slavery within the United States. Even a majority of Civil War soldiers who were able to vote, basically, I think around like 80% of them voted for Lincoln as well. I don't want to overstate things either, but I think at the very least, you can say that by this point there was pretty much a majority consensus for the end of slavery within the United States. Again, this is 1864. This is just a year before the Civil War ended, and I'm sure there were still many people who had reluctant feelings over that. And if you go even a couple years prior to that, maybe even a majority of people in this country would have been willing to see the war end without that. But that didn't happen, and of course, that's the way in which things worked out. Then afterwards, you have the Reconstruction era. Eric Foner has written on that quite extensively. So did W.E.B. Du Bois in his book Black Reconstruction in America. He has a number of interesting things to say about this, which I'll read out here. He talks about basically the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War, which was basically meant to sort of oversee Reconstruction in the South. Now, again, this was something which was carried out through the military occupation of the South by the Northern Army. So the Secretary of War was to issue necessary provisions, clothing, and fuel under the direction of the president. The commissioner could set aside for freedmen and refugee tracts of land not more than 40 acres, the famous phrase 40 acres and a mule, to be leased to tenants. The leasees were to be protected in the use of land for 3 years at a low rent. At the end of the term, the tenant could purchase the land at an appraised value. So the government was going to basically directly see to the not just the protection of civil rights, but actual economic support given to the former slaves. Unfortunately, the commitment of the government to this did not last very long and basically evaporated very quickly once the military was essentially pulled out. But there were attempts, again, to create hospitals and schools, to provide education for former slaves, to provide economic support for former slaves, to provide voting rights as well, which really is what upset the Southerners. I mean that's supposedly what set John Wilkes Booth off to kill Lincoln is when Lincoln came out in support of voting rights for the former slaves. Now Du Bois talks here about the what he refers later on to as a dictatorship of the proletariat, using Marx's famous term. Here made up of the former slaves and the poor whites, which he says are to hold the overwhelming balance of political power. So this was a revolution in a sense. Some people, refer to this as the second American Revolution. Some people also say that this was, the revolution that failed also. Or some people refer to Reconstruction as the second Civil War, and the second Civil War was won by the South. by the way. But that's what makes this a period of time such an interesting period of time to look at, is that for at least a few years, there was an attempt to actually create some level of economic equality among poor whites and even among the former slaves, and to take political power away from the Southern landowning class. Obviously, the Northerners, and particularly the Northern Army, had no love for the Southern ruling class, who had just fought a bloody civil war against them. So they were more than willing to take power away from these people and give it to the hands, even to former slaves, rather than give it to, back to the hands of the people that they were just fighting against, which makes sense if you consider, the context of the war. So here's where he refers to it as the dictatorship of the proletariat. And he refers to, of course, the difficulties in implementing something like this. The failure to realize as such dictatorship must last long enough to really put the mass of workers in power. But this would be, in fact, a dictatorship of the proletariat, which must endure until the proletariat, or at least a leading united group with clear objects and effective method, had education and experience and had taken firm control of the economic organization of the South. Unfortunately, the power set to begin this dictatorship was the military arm of a government, which more and more was falling into the hands of organized wealth, and of wealth organized on a scale never before seen in modern civilization. So what Du Bois is referring to here is that you have these sort of, contradictory goals of trying to create what he calls a dictatorship of the proletariat, made up of, poor white farmers mostly, and former slaves, taking power away from, the plantation owners. But this could only be accomplished first of all, through a military occupation. So you have the United States government trying to create this almost like Marxist experiment in working class power, but it could only last as long as the military was committed to this. And at the same time, you have a government which is controlled by a political party, which more and more, as he says, is falling into the hands of organized wealth, which is, basically, becomes the Republican Party that we all know and love to this very day, right? The party of the big business interest in the United States. Early on, the early phase of the Republican Party always had that in it, but I think there was sort of these, conflicting tendencies within the Republican Party. It always had the support of Northern business interests, industrialists, but there were, genuinely, socially minded reformers and progressives, and even arguably socialists who, wanted to wield, political power for a different purpose, of course. Kind of a strange thing to imagine that within the Republican Party. Anyway, we kind of know how that story played out. The big business interests asserted control, which they continue to do to this very day. And of course, that pretty much quickly ended Reconstruction within the United States. Now, of course, there's a lot more that can be said about this. I'm just going a brief overview. Now I'd like to jump into the New Deal period itself, and really sort of analyze it using the book In Fear Itself by Ira Katznelson, who has a few interesting things to say about it. So Katznelson points out the role in which Southern Democrats, segregationists, were essential to the New Deal. Basically, the New Deal would not have been passed without the support of the Southern Democrats, which means, of course, that they had leverage to sort of tailor the New Deal programs in a way that which would suit their preferences as well. Which means, of course, that they were able to basically exclude most African Americans from the economic programs of the New Deal. They were also played a important role in the U.S. Preparations for World War II. They were, against Nazi Germany and their expansion throughout Europe. He argues that this created what he calls a Southern cage that shaped the American state. It was weak in regulating capital, but it was strong and violent abroad. So even though they were opposed to Nazi Germany, it was essentially only because they wanted to be the conquerors themselves. They want to exert more power on the world stage, and of course did not put a lot of restraint on business interests within the United States, as well as of course enforcing white supremacy as well. Now again, Castelson points out a very sort of interesting sort of dialectical tendency here. If we go back to Berthold Ohlmann's idea of the dance of the dialectic, the sort of contradictory aspects that play themselves out throughout history. Despite initial support, the South's own creation backfired, he says. World War II mobilization empowered Black veterans and labor activists. Legal precedents against New Deal power became tools for civil rights litigation. Still, of course, so even though it backfired to some extent, of course, that was limited to some extent, it could not challenge, this is referring to the government, could not challenge residential segregation, which we still very much have to this day, economic inequality, or mass incarceration. Civil rights progress did occur, but occurred within the constraints of the Cold War, something which, Piven and Cloward talk about as well. Why the New Deal? Why did the New Deal come about when it did? And of course, you can't understand that without understanding the context of the Great Depression of the 1930s, the most significant challenge since the Civil War and the worst economic downturn in American history. Certainly, the consequences for the population of a whole has never been worse. If the crisis of 2008 and even of 2020 were somewhat mitigated to some extent, it was because there was some existence of a kind of social welfare state which could kind of kick in and deal with these things. When the Depression happened in the beginning, it really in the late 1920s, but before Roosevelt is elected in 1932, there was nothing. There was no protection at all that people had against mass unemployment and the inability to generate income to provide for food and housing and everything else. The Depression was a worldwide phenomenon, but of course it was started in the United States after the stock market crash in 1929. It contributed to the rise of Hitler in Germany and even helped Stalin consolidate power in the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was less affected by it, and in many ways it sort of was a benefit to Stalin, which made it seem that their system is better able to sort of insulate itself against this. Now I would point to certain tensions in Katznelson's book as well. He kind of wavers to some extent. It both warns of dictatorship and concedes the U.S. was never truly at risk of it. So Katznelson, on the one hand, argues that the New Deal became a necessary thing to sort of, prevent a dictatorship from emerging in the United States, which explains why it was sort of the most, sort of radical program of social reforms ever seen in the United States, even far exceeding what we've seen afterwards. I mean, we can talk about the response of the Obama and Biden administrations to other economic crises, and the very sort of mediocre response of both. Most of Biden's things basically expired after a year, which as I pointed out in a previous class, I mean imagine if the New Deal just basically just unwound itself after a year. Instead, it became sort of a permanent structure, which continues to last, even attempts to sort of roll it back over the last several decades. And Obama's, I mean, even people at the time commented on how underwhelming the so-called Obama stimulus was, in the aftermath of the 2008 crash. In contrast, the New Deal was a much more ambitious and even radical program, which, well, like I said, even sort of exceeds what people have tried to do afterwards. So, what would motivate the government, which historically speaking had been so resistant to implement any kind of economic reforms, have any kind of government provided welfare or any kind of government intervention in the economy? What would prompt the government to take such a radical role? One narrative of this is that, well, it became a necessary thing. They maybe didn't want to, but they felt like that they had to do something like this. Otherwise, the United States faced the threat of either a kind of fascist insurgency within the United States, or even possibility the emergence of again a radical revolutionary socialist workers movement. So the New Deal was basically implemented as a way to save uh, 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 implemented as a way to save capitalism, and it did. It did do that, by the way. But to what extent can we really credibly believe that there was a real fear of either a dictatorship or a revolution within the United States? Again, Castleton tends to waver on this a little bit. And he seems to warn of it on the one hand, but then also said, well, there's never really a chance anything like this would ever happen in the United States. Well, who knows? I mean, also, I mean, if not, then why did they do that? They certainly had to go pretty far from what they were, used to doing in order to, make sure that the capitalist system continued to function. What would have happened if they didn't do anything? In a review of the book, Jeremy Kessler, writing for Jacobin magazine, emphasizes this point as well. Despite Castelson's framing, the U.S. was not at risk of dictatorship or revolution. Jacobin is supposed to be like a socialist magazine also, and he even more emphatically makes the point, no, there's no chance you would ever see a socialist revolution here in the United States. As generations of Americans, historians have concluded, neither fascism nor communism was in the cards for the United States. Sort of a very casual dismissal of that. Kessler also writes, most tellingly, fear itself provides no sustained analysis of what dictatorship of the United States might have looked like. Well, fortunately, I would argue that, again, Sheldon Wolin does provide an analysis of that in his book, Democracy Incorporated, which is that this idea of inverted totalitarianism, that you would have had a dictatorship which sort of, preserves the idea, the sort of, facade of democratic institutions, basically. Now, let me push back upon this a little bit. I love it that, socialists in this country, this is sort of a personal grievance of mine, but socialists in the United States are always, they love to tell other people that socialism has no chance in the United States. Well, why are you a socialist then? They claim to be in favor of revolution, yet they're always telling people, well, now is not the right time for revolution. Well, when is the right time? And as someone with a certain type of platform, shouldn't you be trying to tell people that we should be having a revolution? I mean, imagine if Donald Trump did things like that. And I don't mean to give Donald Trump any credit here, but imagine if he was always telling his supporters, nah, we're too weak. We don't have the support to really do what we want to do, which is basically what these, socialist leaders are always telling people here in the United States. Oh, the left is too weak. We can't really do these things now. I mean, what kind of leadership is that? Anyway, well, I mean, allow me then to try to push back on that narrative a little bit. And I'm not saying necessarily we've had a communist revolution here in the United States, but I think you have to maybe not be so casual in dismissing that there were very strong worker-led movements here in the United States that did pose a threat, and the elites in this country were certainly worried about. Now, elites in this country tend to panic over things a lot too. I understand that. But as I said, earlier in the class, I mean, I don't think you want to discount that there have been revolutionary movements here in the United States, and they've been crushed. If you listen to people like Kessler, and even Castelson to a certain extent, they would have you think that the Americans have never had any appetite for revolution in this country, and that's simply not true. There have been revolutionary movements here in this country. The problem is that not that they weren't popular or successful or didn't strike out and resonate with the public as a whole, is that as they were gaining strength, they were crushed violently, and its leaders oftentimes killed or jailed. I mean, that's why you didn't have a revolutionary movement here in this country, not because of lack of interest on the part of people, but because of the direct violent suppression of these movements by the United States government. So let's look at some briefly. In my article, I talk about the Red Scare after World War I, the context of a lot of the Supreme Court cases I analyzed during that period of time. Again, I mean, this is something that people don't seem to acknowledge much anymore. But from the late 19th century, maybe from about the 1880s up until about World War One, the left, particularly a socialist left, was a growing force within the United States. World War One sort of ended that in many ways. It allowed, again, as I've covered, for the suppression of these movements, people being convicted for speaking out against the war. Then after the aftermath of the Russian Revolution of 1917 created this sort of hysteria against communism in the United States. Also in this period of time, you have the Attorney General under Woodrow Wilson, a Democratic president, again, doing mass arrests of people, deporting people from the country as well. Very interesting parallels here between this and the current Trump administration. You had violent crackdowns on labor movements, the Haymarket Massacre, the Pullman Strike, the Homestead Strike, some of which we've talked about already. Again, I'll refer back to the Presidential Commission on Violence in the late 1960s, in the aftermath of several urban riots and the assassination of Martin Luther King. One panel on this commission was devoted to labor issues, and they concluded the United States had the most violent labor struggles of any industrialized country. Now, where's that violence coming from? You don't inflict violence upon people if they're passive and just doing what you told them to do. I mean, the fact that so much violence was used against the working class was because the working class was rising up against these things. You have the deportation of radicals like the anarchist Emma Goldman, the defendants in the Abrams case that I talk about, FBI infiltration and harassment of socialist and black radical movements, COINTELPRO, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Malcolm X, the assassination of Fred Hampton, the infiltration of the Socialist Workers' Party, anti-communist purges during McCarthyism. You have, I would argue to this very day, the systematic exclusion of socialist voices from media and electoral systems. Certainly a sort of more, again, revolutionary socialism, what you get instead are kind of lukewarm, AOCs and Bernie Sanders. And yes, even Mamdani as well, who were, asking for very moderate things. And look, they have their political calculation of why they think that's the necessary thing to do. They're entitled to that, of course, but I mean, there's no way to mistake the fact that what their policies are asking for. These are extremely moderate things being passed off as socialism. Now again, on the other hand, though, you have to acknowledge that the U.S. capital class was a very strong class and may not have even if you had a strong workers movement in this country, the strength of the capitalist class may have been able to deal with that. And, they kind of did, like I said, in many ways, but they were much more politically coherent, much more thought as a group rather than working class people, which unfortunately have been, beset by all sorts of racial and other forms of division, and of course, most of the blame for that goes to the white working class in this country, which has been reluctant to form alliances with black working class people for the most part, at least historically speaking. That's probably less true now, though, than it was, back then, of course. So, yeah, I mean, keep all that in mind. And of course, their willingness to use outright violence, people would even argue, the distance of the United States from Europe made this harder. Socialism was sort of centered in Europe at this point in time, at least up until the Russian Revolution. So there's a lot of things you can analyze here, and unfortunately, I can't go into it too much. I do think that the narrative people like Kessler and even Cass Nelson to an extent offers is very sort of rigid narrative. It's sort of looking retroactively on things and very sort of casually dismissing the possibilities that may have existed back then. things. In other words, from reading them, you get a sense that things could only play out the way that they actually did. There was never a chance that things ever could have been different. And I'm just arguing that maybe it could have been. And I think it's very important also to keep in mind and have a sort of living, working memory of these past struggles and past movements of people as well. I'll quote the German literary critic Walter Benjamin, who himself was a victim of the Nazis as well. He writes, the past carries a secret index with it by which it is referred to its resurrection. Kind of an ambiguous phrase. That's kind of why I like it, though. Basically, what I get out of that is that Benjamin is arguing that history is a battlefield. The memories of the oppressed past can suddenly become relevant, politically alive at moments of rupture. So we have to remember the people have, struggled against these things in the past as well. And sometimes these past movements can give us sort of, inspiration in the present day as well. We shouldn't totally forget these things. So, of course, Roosevelt wins quite handily in 1932, basically a landslide. Wins even stronger in 1936. We go on to win elections in 1940 and 1944 as well. The only president to serve more than 2 terms in office. He died very early in his 4th term, however. Then you jump ahead to the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson wins another landslide victory, who modeled himself after FDR. Obviously, there's a lot of history I'm leaving out here. But his support of civil rights in 1964, probably a lot of sympathy over the Kennedy assassination as well, helps propel him to another basically landslide victory over Barry Goldwater in 1964. You'll notice here, however, that unlike Roosevelt, Johnson no longer has the support of the South, at least a portion of the South. And this is really the beginning of the process where you see the South start to flip to the Republican side, where you can see the red states and blue states here. The South, believe it or not, up until the 1960s was a blue state area. It's only since then that it has basically become a permanent sort of red state area. And the rest of the country kind of, that you have the East Coast and West Coast, the Northeast and the West Coast are basically, the solid blue areas. And then, the rest of the country kind of flips back and forth to some extent or another. Now we have the Reagan cycle. So again, presidents after FDR tended to govern in very similar ways. Even Republican presidents, Eisenhower, Nixon, and Ford. During the 1970s, however, that system fell apart. The idea that the government could manage the economy was increasingly becoming a discredited idea because of the economic challenges of the 1970s. You had a very serious recession in the mid 1970s. You had another serious recession in the early 1980s as well. I haven't gone too much into it, but I do think that the New Deal in many ways was very overrated in its ability to get the country out of the Great Depression. If you look at 1941, right before the U.S. got involved in the war, unemployment in the country was very high. And then these policies were continued even after World War II, and it was seen that this was a way to manage the economy. The U.S. economy, of course, entered an era of unmatched prosperity in the 1950s and 1960s, where you see, the share of income going to labor is going up. People's living standards are getting better and better for the most part. Even people like African Americans who had normally been excluded from these economic gains, smaller amount kind of trickled down there a little bit, which probably helped the formation of the civil rights movement. And it's believed that these kinds of New Deal style policies of fairly, significant government intervention in the economy was a necessary thing to sort of manage the economy. I think what really explains that, though, is that the U.S. coming out of World War II was in a very advantageous position. That a lot of the it was sort of a resetting of the rate of profit, if you look at it in a Marxist way. It was sort of a great reset to the process of capital accumulation, sort of let capital accumulation restart itself again. And for a period of time, that system led to a high rate of profit, led to economic benefits sort of trickling down to working class people. But by the 1970s, starting to run into problems. The rate of profit is beginning to fall down again. Marxists would say this is because of the high rate of investment in constant capital, machines, and raw materials versus variable capital, workers producing surplus value. You also have other factors involved: the rebuilding of Germany and Japan after World War II, competing more against American, basically corporate monopolies at this point in time, the auto industry, the steel industry. Very I can't go into full blown economic analysis of it, but that gives you some indication of it. And this sort of cleared the way for Ronald Reagan and the Reagan cycle, which is almost like the inversion of the New Deal. If the New Deal was about more government intervention in the economy to provide for social welfare, higher taxes on the wealthy, greater representation of labor in politics, the Reagan cycle was like the opposite of all those things. Cut taxes on the wealthy, crush labor, crush organized labor, and shrink the presence of the government in the economy, at least to the extent that it provides social welfare. Military spending's fine. We'll keep the government spending on the military, and the government's okay to help out corporations in various ways, but otherwise we're going to move away from the New Deal aspects of these things. And I would argue we're still very much there to this very day. We're also basically, I think people have to understand, we're living in an extremely conservative period of time in American history. I sometimes call it the secret chapter of American history because it's probably not that secret anymore. But I mean, most people would recognize the period from the 1930s, basically up until the 1980s, was a time of increasing liberalism in the United States. The country was becoming more and more liberal in various ways, socially, economically. Groups that had been marginalized for long periods of time in American history were gaining more access and representation. The country was becoming more diverse socially as well. Everyone acknowledges that. Whether you like it or not is a different thing. I mean, some people hate those things. I know conservative people that hate what the 1960s represented and things like that, but they at least acknowledge that it happened. It seems much less people are willing to acknowledge that basically the period of time since the 1980s, the American country has gotten increasingly moved away from that, and has in many ways kind of gone backwards. It's sort of regressed back before the 1960s, even back before the 1930s. In some ways, especially if you think about it in terms of labor issues and things like that. The balance of power between capital and labor in this country. And that we're in fact living through an extremely conservative period of time in American history. And I would argue Democratic administrations which have fallen within that period have provided no real alternative to it as well. Here you can see Reagan wins 1980 and in 1984 landslide elections. You can see, by the way, Minnesota, the only state not to vote for Ronald Reagan in 1984. Interesting thing to point out in light of recent events. All right, I've already talked a lot about the rate of profit in previous classes. I'm not going to go through it here. I'm going to start wrapping things up. But as evidence for the fact that the Democratic administrations of this time have not provided much of an alternative, let's briefly consider what happened during the Clinton administration. Besides his impeachment and his extramarital affairs, which apparently continues to this very day. I don't know why a guy with that much scrutiny on him would keep getting caught for things like this, including some very serious allegations as well. But policy-wise, I mean, what are basically the five biggest things that happened to Clinton? According to the historian Thomas Frank, they are NAFTA, welfare reform, the crime bill, deregulating finance, and deregulating media. So NAFTA led to significant, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, significant job displacement here in the United States, many manufacturing jobs, which had already been going overseas. That pace accelerated. Even more hands led to even more income inequality in the United States. I've already showed that famous, Piketty and Sayers graph on income inequality in the United States multiple times. So I'm not going to show it here now. But again, the United States could only be characterized as an extreme level of wealth and income inequality that exists here in this country. And then mostly begins, well, it begins in the 1970s, but it significantly accelerates in the decades following. And again, Democratic administration in this period of time basically been able to do very little about it. If anything, little, tiny, small, incremental changes that you would barely even notice, quite frankly, although it might show up as a statistical fact, as people like Dean Baker like to point out. Clinton also, basically, gutted welfare, ended welfare as we know it, as he famously said, or as people just say, well, he ended welfare, basically. The crime bill of 1994, which many people point to as this, the single law most responsible for creating the mass incarceration state in this country, repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, which led to the explosion in financial trading, which played a significant role, of course, in the 2007, 2008 crisis. The mergers created the so-called too big to fail institutions, which are even bigger now, by the way, than they were in 2008. And you have the deregulation of media, which led to, now we have like 5 media conglomerates control like 90% of media in this country. And we've seen any number of examples of how this kind of corporate control of media, from news media to down the line, different aspects of culture and the negative effects of that. I'm running through this very fast, but I've been talking for a while here. I'm rapidly running out of gas. Let me talk a little bit about the Obama administration and his first 100 days in office. Those things didn't all happen within Clinton's first 100 days, by the way. But probably the most significant thing that happened during Obama's first 100 days was the so-called Obama stimulus, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. I'll pretty much end things here. I won't get to talk about Biden. I have addressed it, I think, in other classes. But let's talk about the Obama stimulus, what it was. $787 billion stimulus package, later reestimated to about $830 billion. Mostly, or a good portion of it basically composed of tax cuts, not actual spending, aid to states and local governments, infrastructure spending, expansion of unemployment benefits, temporary, funding for education, health, IT, and renewable energy. This is by far the most important thing. There's other thing, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act makes it easier for workers to file pay discrimination lawsuits. I mean, it doesn't even sound like that big of a thing. Children's health insurance program, added 4 million children to health insurance, gave states the option to cover undocumented children. Again, a very small thing to dealing with the gaping problem of health insurance in this country. Now the stimulus is, of course, the big one. So let's talk about this. So of the about $830 billion, about $300 billion was basically just tax cuts. So no real new spending. The government's actually not actually spending any money. It's just basically collecting less tax from corporations, hoping that those tax credits will boost the economy. Well, they didn't really. Direct spending, about $275 billion, mostly on infrastructure. Aid to states, about $224 billion. Very small safety net expansions as well. Why was insufficient? The U.S. economy faced a 2 to 3 trillion output gap over several years. So you need to spend about that much money to compensate for that. Obviously, this was well below that amount, even less than $1 trillion. Unemployment fueled by a housing crash, credit freeze, and collapse of consumer spending. Yet the stimulus was only about 4 or 5% of GDP, spread mostly over 2 to 3 years. Critics, variety of fairly mainstream critics like Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, and others basically argue the stimulus needed to be about 2 to 3 times larger to be effective, which it was not. Too much of it was made up of tax cuts, which have a very weak stimulus effect. Tax cuts are often saved instead of spent, for example. Nearly 1/3 of it, again, went to tax cuts. most of the spending was too slow to roll out. The so-called shovel-ready jobs. Obama later joked, shovel-ready wasn't as shovel-ready as we expected. It was very nice of him to make a joke about it. But basically, yes, the actual spending on infrastructure and things like that happened at a very slow pace. And really didn't do enough by the time the Democrats basically lost control of the Congress in the massive rout of the 2010 House elections. Um, Let me move on a little bit. One of the major impacts, besides the fairly weak stimulus, is that the Obama administration was much more effective, however, at reinflating the economic bubble that the United States economy had basically become leading up to 2008. But what they did is they created an even bigger bubble, what some people refer to as the everything bubble. So, a bubble, conventionally speaking, is when there's sort of artificial demand created in the economy. So people are buying things, but it's not actually based on actual income or where people can actually spend. It's sort of inflated by financial speculation. That's what led up to the housing bubble in 2008. So the policy of the Obama administration created essentially an everything bubble, which meant that everything became inflated: stocks, bonds, real estates, other financial assets. After the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and other central banks poured money into markets via low interest rates and quantitative easing, which basically the Federal Reserve would give, trillions of dollars to financial institutions in exchange for the bad assets which they had. Cheap credit made borrowing extremely easy. Asset prices soared. Investors flush with cheap debt poured money into stocks, bonds. Like I said, rising asset prices created capital gains, which reinforce the perception of wealth. Capital gains is wealth that you get through ownership of stocks and bonds and real estate. The average person doesn't see any increase in this. You would have to own these things to see a significant increase in it. And owning one house isn't the same thing as owning multiple properties, by the way. And of course, many people don't own their houses. Debt as fuel. Both corporations and households leverage these rising asset prices. Corporations issue debt to buy back stock, inflating stock prices further. We talked about this with the meeting of these big tech CEOs and Trump kissing Trump's ass and things like that. I mean, this is why they want this thing to continue. Homeowners and investors borrowed against rising real estate. This created a feedback loop. Rising asset prices justified more borrowing, which led to more debt, which led to more asset inflation, which led to more capital gains, which just fueled the process again, led to even more borrowing, and so on. This created the everything bubble, where almost all asset classes, equities, real estate, bonds, collectibles were inflated beyond what production-based valuation could justify. In other words, based on the value produced in productive enterprise, what was greatly inflated past that. This has created a highly sensitive and fragile system. The system is highly sensitive to shocks. Any sharp correction in asset prices, like say tech stocks or companies heavily invested in AI, for example. Now, people would argue that the everything bubble is now sort of narrowed into the AI bubble, where some people would argue that the AI bubble is just one aspect of the larger everything bubble. Whatever, you can debate that. But any the chain reaction essentially that would happen from even a fairly minor fall in stock prices would set off a massive reaction, which could bring the economy to another crash. Basically on the scale, maybe even bigger than previous crashes. If you look at the level of debt that exists in the economy, it's far greater than what exists in 2008 and even in 2020. So, and because so much of these stocks and bonds are basically bought on debt, if these debts are not paid or there's an interruption in their payment, and since people use the high value of stocks as their collateral to borrow more money, all the inter connections of these things could have a massive effect. So we're a highly fragile system. Unlike industrial capitalism, growth isn't primarily from production or innovations from financial speculation and rent extraction, according to Michael Hudson. Some Marxist economists like Norris and Espinoza would argue that, well, that's maybe part of the case. Within the tech world itself, these tech companies are actually, creating uh, a, a productive value. So it's not rent in the literal sense of economic rent, um, but it is inflated profits. Basically, it's basically what they call surplus profits, which stem from the fact these companies are basically giant monopolies. So either way, even if they are, creating actual value, even if they have employees that are productive and create surplus value through their labor, the profits are still greatly, enhanced and inflated by their monopolistic status. That's in the tech world. What Hudson's talking about could be, applied more specifically to the financial world, where people are basically just, extracting rent, basically that they're creating wealth, but basically not out of any real productive activity, just basically over their ownership of scarce resources. It's a little bit complicated. The tech world is interesting, and it seems to have one foot in each of these worlds. It has one foot in sort of the financialized world of rent extraction, but also another foot maybe in the productive world as well, but also, again, inflated by their monopolistic status. Anyway, it's a very fragile system. My point being with all this is that the Obama administration did nothing about any of this, and in fact made things worse. And the process has made the system even more fragile and made the country much more unequal as well. And then, of course, this plays a big role in the election of Donald Trump in 2016. You can see Biden won in 2020, carrying a lot of these Midwestern states, which have been particularly hard hit by globalization. And then, of course, we go into 2024, where, you can see, once again, these states in the Midwestern region switching back to Trump as well. These people are not making a lot of money off of their capital gains, basically. They don't own a lot of stock in Apple, in other words. All right, so that'll pretty much wrap it up here. And yeah, so that's it. So take care, everyone.